All right, so we last week there wasn't a teaching. We still went ahead. It was Thanksgiving, so we had that. So chapter 11. If in your groups you didn't discuss that, you can certainly reflect back and talk about that. Was the transition from Saul to David. So this was then getting to David's getting introduced to David, this unlikely one who was anointed to follow Saul. He was the youngest of Jesse's sons, wasn't thought to be even a contender to be named as the son when Samuel came to anoint them. So he was out tending the sheep. All right, no, he's the one. What's fascinating, though, and we highlighted this in worship, and this gets emphasized every time that David's call story or David's anointing story gets told, is how God does not, God looks upon the heart, not upon the appearance. So, and that's good. That's important for us to know and to hear, and we can trust in that. What's fascinating is how often the biblical authors go out of their way to just explain how much of a hottie David was. And so I think that's, though, a clue for us to pay attention to the assumptions, the biases, and those human realities of the biblical authors as well. That there are those sorts of things that, it seems dissonance to say, the Lord looks upon the heart, and then in the next breath, but David was young and handsome, a dashing figure. Because there's still that thing because we are, while we understand that and we appreciate that God does that for us, we struggle to extend that to others as well. And so I think that's important for us because we talk a lot about the exterior and can get very concerned about that. But it's just interesting to see how the biblical writers' perspectives sneak in there as well. So that's just something to keep in the back of our minds, especially as we move forward in David's story today. So then there's also, the David and Goliath story, and then everything else leading up then to David becoming the king following Saul. We hear of Saul's death at the end of chapter 11 as well. So as we start chapter 12, the quote that I want to share, and it's on your handout as well, from a book I'm reading right now called The God Who Trusts by William Curtis Holtzman. And he writes this: "We cannot save ourselves, and I do not hold that God trusts us to do so." All right, we're Lutheran, so we know we cannot save ourselves. And God trusts us not, God doesn't think we're supposed to either. But God's trust does not begin only after we have shown ourselves to be trustworthy. No, God trusts us first. Perhaps the first act of divine faith in each of our lives is God entrusting us with grace. Which is to say that God's first move is to trust us. And that God has entrusted us with many gifts. The gift of grace is what Holtzman is saying is among that, and the way that gets lived out. The gift of this life, the gift of our abilities. So God entrusts all of these things to us. And so not only is it, an act of faith for us to find that God is trustworthy, that we can trust God, but it's also important for us to think that God has acts of faith towards us, that God trusts us. Now it's up to us to let God know, I suppose, if that's a well-placed trust or not. But that's the nature of the real relationship that God has with us. Not only that we trust God, but that God trusts us as well, and then all that brings with it. And that can be perhaps a way to give us a little insight even into how the Bible comes to be and what the Bible even seeks to do or can do. Because like I was talking about with those views of David, that God does not look on the outward appearance but looks on the heart. Yeah, but David, man, whoo. So God trusts those biblical writers to share the truth. And part of God trusting is there's this other stuff that might wind up in there too. So just, again, something to keep in mind. So this chapter, chapter 12, the trials of a king, I find it a terribly ironic title. I don't know if you've read the chapter. These feel like self-imposed trials, quite honestly. So when we say the trials of a king, it seems like it's the things that the king has to endure from the outside. But let's see just who's making these trials happen. But anyway, before we get into that, I'm curious. So someone asks you to describe King David. What comes to mind, or how would you describe David, the biblical figure? What would you offer about David? What comes to mind initially for you? Devoted to Saul, yes. So there's that great story in chapter 11, where Saul's in the cave, and it puts it relieving himself. Biology was real back then, and David cuts the edge of his cloak rather than killing him. And so, yes, as an act of devotion to Saul. How else would you describe David? Extended the kingdom of Israel. All right, yep. Trusted God implicitly. Brave. Loved music and prayer. Yeah. Complicated. That's a good word. A sinner but obedient. All right. Anything else that crops to mind? So just if you do just like a search, some images for David, so we got him as a shepherd playing a harp, looking awfully, Caucasian. That's probably not right. But fair-haired, innocent looking. We've got David killing Goliath. We heard about that story last week. I don't know why this is thought of as a kid's story. Really? It's even reading those, like what got read out loud, I felt so bad. These young kids getting their first communion, and then they have to hear the Bible. Have you read the Bible? And that's just a warm-up. What's coming next, Cindy? Well, and so, right. And yeah. And so, and we'll get into that this week as well. So, but what's interesting, so we've got this very violent story of David killing Goliath and then chopping his head off too, which is, something else. So, and then, we've got King David. So all these are very Caucasian Davids. I don't know. There's not a lot. Maybe it's the Michelangelo influence that David somehow looks Italian because of that. But we know he wasn't. But kind of a regal, kind of very respectful looking person. So I'm glad someone offered the word complicated in describing David. So I think maybe here's the thing. So we've got all these images of David and then artistically how he's portrayed, and quite often he's put up on a pedestal to say King David. King David. So I want to talk about shaving cream. Here's what I'm going to say about shaving cream. I got a new thing. You're really interested in this. I got a new canister of shaving cream. And on it described itself as smells like the ocean. I guess they ran out of like evocative names, like how paint, what naming paint chips, just made up things. And, usually any of the different scents we have for any personal goods have, some flowery, this just decided to forego any flowery language. It says smells like the ocean, because that's a good thing. So it's supposed to be evocative of the pleasant aroma of the water and the atmosphere and whatever. So it's that. But then I got to thinking while I was shaving this morning, smelling like the ocean. It was very pleasant smelling. But I've been to the ocean too, and there's some nice smells. But I've been to the ocean when there's dead jellyfish washed up, And, there's seagulls pecking away at everything, and it's not necessarily a very great smell all the time. There are good parts, there are bad parts. And so I think that's with David as well. We don't want to just say he smells like the ocean and say that's all good. But he's a very complicated figure, a very complicated figure. And I think that's really important for us to keep in mind, that maybe putting him up on a pedestal and kind of admiring him from a distance and valorizing him isn't in line with kind of what his actions deserve in the end, and maybe doesn't do us or even God any favors by doing that as well. Because we'll be reminded in a couple moments too of what we heard from Samuel a few weeks ago. So we've got David out there, complicated figure. So just to pivot, to dive straight into what we'll get to this week, what comes to mind when you think of the season of spring? I'm not asking this because we have this huge snowfall and we want to think warm thoughts, but just when you think of spring, what comes to mind? Bright green, not this white, right? So bright green, new life, birth, warmth. Yeah, we for sure. Nostalgia. We can have, I think every season someone has it's winter and makes me think, so yeah, absolutely. Fresh, yeah, all right, so just some spring images just to warm our, so tulips. I remember when my family, we moved, Karen and our first calls were in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And so we started our new calls in Ames, Iowa. And if you want to know how far away where we were in the UP was from Ames, because it feels like, Michigan, that's not so far, and then Ames, that's not so far. It's as far as the crow flies to go from the UP, where we were, to Ames, Iowa, as Ames, Iowa to Oklahoma City. I mean, so this is a long way. But we started our new call. We started I think it was in March where we started. And so we left, and, we were in the UP where there's 200 inches of snow and whatever else. So we, those poor movers had to, get all the stuff out of our house and get it. And then we got to Ames, and there were tulips. I mean, talk about spring in a heartbeat. So we got tulips, or what else? Fred, we're not wanting. There we go. So yeah, kind of that new life. We've got, as long as those ladybugs stay out of my house, that's good. Robin's eggs, things like that. Little chicks. So, spring brings these, budding new life, and as long as your allergies stay in check. So again, birds and bird songs, and all the flowering trees. But what about this? Because, so this was actually, I think about the 15th century BC in Egypt. So this is even, it's a long ways ago. So, but the idea here is this is what 2 Samuel 11 verse 1 says. In the spring of the year, all right, they're not talking tulips though, the time when kings go out to battle. The way it gets translated in the NIV, or if you're reading, it's the very first sentence of chapter 12 of the story. The time when the kings go out to war. David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him. They ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. But get this. But David remained in Jerusalem. Well, what is spring about? What happens in spring? The kings go out to battle. The kings go out to war. And we'll set aside the moral component of that, but just say that that's what kings do. And right from the jump, this could be a clue for us. Kings do this, but David remained at Jerusalem. So already there's a dissonance between what he should be doing in his role as king and what he is doing. And this is just the very tip of the iceberg. And so, it's such an R-rated chapter. It is such an R-rated chapter. I mean, this is, Craig Kester, one of my seminary professors, he's a Revelation scholar. And so just fascinating insight into that book and demystifying and kind of taking it back from really violent, awful interpretations. But the way he describes it is that the Bible is adult strength literature. And it truly is. 2 Samuel 11, and what it deals with 2 Samuel 12, and then 2 Samuel 13, which we'll get to at the end, which is so, it's not even in the story. But it's worth paying attention to. So we've got this going on, and I'm going to trust that you're going to read the chapter, you're familiar with all of this. And so what is worth us thinking through? Again, here's the irony, the trials of a king, because of what happens next. And so what we are reminded of is Samuel's warning back in 1 Samuel chapter 8. So remember, the people wanted a human king. Samuel's like, God's your king. You've got the king. No. We want to be like everybody. Everybody else is doing it, so why can't we? We want a king, like all the other nations. They're doing great. We want to do great. And so, and God tells Samuel, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me as their king. But God still works. So it's important for us to keep that frame of reference as we move forward. That's the foundation of this line of kings, is actually the people's rejection of God. And then God still works with them. But one of the things that Samuel warns the people about what a human king is going to do is a human king is going to take. Going to take. So we get to this very R-rated story. And these are some questions in addition to the field guide that you can talk about and reflect. So we have these first few verses. David is out. He sees Bathsheba bathing. So it's rooftop, and archaeologically, he's the king. He's got the highest roof, so he can look down on anyone. And he's the king. He can look down on anyone literally and figuratively. He looks down, sees Bathsheba bathing. So this is what we would know as a peeping Tom, right? So he sends Joab, his military commander, out to war rather than going to war like the other kings are doing. He stands on his rooftop as a voyeur. So it's important for us, because there are people that want to make this about somehow Bathsheba tempting David, which profoundly misunderstands the patriarchy, which profoundly misunderstands the power that the king of Israel had. And it's, again, that interpretation only comes when we put David up on a pedestal and say, but it's David. He can't be like that. It had to be, he wasn't perfect, but he wouldn't. But okay, so he's shirking his duties. He's a peeping Tom. And then he sends the messengers to get her. To get her. So I'm just kind of curious, and this would be something maybe worth your time discussing in your groups. Could Bathsheba decline David? Could she, so there are issues of consent here. What's the nature of what's happening in this rooftop scene? He's the king of Israel.
I would say in those days, no, she couldn't.
No, I think you're right. So it's kind of an image, again, a very white David, but, I don't know that Bathsheba could have said no.
But she was married, so didn't those vows mean anything to her?
I've never been a woman. I'm married to one. And I've been the beneficiary of a patriarchal society. I've never had to deal with the underside of it. And so whether or not her marriage vows, I would offer, you can talk about that in your groups. What do you think, or what do you hear that the text may be saying about that? But I don't know that her marriage vows would have stood in David's way.
Well, in my Bible, after she went to him, then she had purified herself from uncleanliness. So I'm not sure that she wanted to.
Yeah, she is pure. That's how you can tell a man uncomfortable with female biology is translating these texts. I mean, it was after her period. And that's something that we get squeamish about talking about, because men don't like thinking that women actually have to, be embodied and have to deal with things that we don't have to deal with. So it's worth thinking about. And thinking, it's complicated. And it's not what we want it to be about. And the story is not about how great David is. David is not a hero. The only hero of the Bible is God. And that's the one who is great in this story. And that's what we hold on to. And so rather than kind of making a false idol out of David, we can stay rooted in that first commandment, you shall have no other gods. So, king's take, that was Samuel's warning. So yes, David takes Uriah's wife, but that's not the only thing, because then that's only putting her, it's even making her kind of his property, which again, in that day and age, would be how she was thought of. But he also is taking Bathsheba's agency, and in some way, even her personhood. King's take. That's what Samuel warned. And that's what David's doing. And then we have David trying, Bathsheba comes, I'm pregnant. And then David, maybe doesn't act with very great honor. He sends for Uriah, come back from the battle that I wasn't going to be a part of. Come back from the battle, go sleep with your wife. Come on, buddy. Wash your feet. Wash your feet is what he says. He gets it. Uriah refuses to do it because no one else is given that. None of the other soldiers are brought home into the comforts of their, a loved one's embrace. Or it's hard to even conceive of marriage the same way that we do these days, so I don't even know how much we want to extrapolate out of that. But David's just trying to cover his tracks. The DNA tests, the paternity tests were still thousands of years away. There was no risk of David winding up on the Jerry Springer show, with the big reveal. So if he could have just gotten Uriah to go and sleep with his wife, then it would have been okay. But we know that Uriah doesn't. In the end, Uriah, as an honorable messenger, is sent with the note that contains his own death sentence back to the front lines where he's killed. So even though David doesn't literally, physically kill Uriah, David makes sure Uriah is killed. And so David's a pretty complicated character. Then we've got Nathan. This prophet who, there's often a prophet associated with different kings. Nathan is the one, and it is quite a thing to imagine how much courage Nathan had to screw up to speak truth to power here. And so Nathan does it by telling a parable. Because David has a pretty artistic bent. David's a smart guy. He's smart. Nathan tells this parable about this, this wealthy guy who has all these sheep. And David gets sheep. He was a shepherd. And then, the wealthy one goes and takes the neighbor's one little ewe lamb and kills it because he doesn't want to give of himself. And again, fascinating, worth reading. Culminating with David convicting himself by saying, that one deserves to die. And then Nathan, again, I can't imagine what it took to point accusatorily at David and say, you are that man. Because Nathan was risking his life. This is the king. Nathan knew what happened to Uriah. But to his credit, verse 13 of 2 Samuel 12 says, then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. So David does admit his fault. David admits his fault. David repents. A lot of the Psalms are attributed to David. Whether or not he specifically wrote them doesn't particularly matter to me, but we can see, for instance, in Psalm 51, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. We sing that all the time. Yeah, those words often get attributed to David as part of this repentance, that he turns back. And so what's important for us to note is that as the story continues, David is far and away the best king, okay? And this is his story, chapter 12, the trials of a king. He's the best one, all right? But the way that he's often described is a man after God's own heart. We have to be clear about what that means, because there's a very specific meaning to what being a man after God's own heart means. It's not saying that God condones everything that David did. That's not what it's saying. What it's saying is that David repented, and unlike almost all the other kings, he did not turn to false idols and false gods. So it's just about that commitment to the one true God. That's what being a man after God's own heart means. It doesn't mean that God was okay with what David did to Bathsheba, to Uriah, so on and so forth. It just means that David didn't turn aside from God. And so we've got this repentance of David turning back. There's a very complicated story after that, though, too, because Nathan replied. So this is the second part of verse 13. The Lord has taken away your sin. You are not going to die. Then a very, very, troubling. I don't know what we could. But because you are doing this, you have shown utter contempt for the Lord. The son born to you will die. So it might be worth, and then you can read beyond that. Who or what killed the baby? I think it's worth talking through that. The text says, God made it happen. And what you do with this verse is really important. Because you could take it quite literally and say, nope, Nathan said this, and it meant that. It meant that God killed that baby as a result of David's sin. You can say that. I don't know I'd want to follow that God or trust that God. This is where it's important for us to know that in antiquity, most any unexplained death was just attributed to, well, God did it. So someone walking down the street drops dead. And they would say, well, it was an act of God. God did it for some reason. We don't know. The God or the gods. It's not just a monotheistic thing, but that was at the hands of the God, because that's kind of how the world worked conceptually. Nowadays, someone could do an autopsy and say, well, it was cardiac arrest as a result of this, that, and the other thing, and that's what killed this person. And so we know that infant mortality rates still are super high in our day and age. They've actually, infant mortality rates have grown in this country among many others in the last few years, which might give us pause to consider how we as people of faith live out some things. But it could be, you can decide if this makes sense. It could be that, because this story is getting told after the fact, that it could be seen, so the child died, and then the way to explain it was to put back in to say, well, it was because of what David did, and that, whereas the actual specific cause of death could have been any number of things. So I think there are ways that we have to tend to these passages, because these are important things. They're right there in the Bible, but it's trying to understand the mindset, and then to rather than just say, well, it says God did it, and because God is God and I'm not, then I should just be okay with that. I don't think that's a faithful way, because we have to. If I'm to find God trustworthy, I don't want to worry that God is going to just strike down my kid because God feels like it. I don't think any of us would trust that God. And I don't think any of us actually think God is like that. And so I think there's a consistency of character, but that's why we keep working through and we wrestle through it. And that's why, again, the Bible's a great conversation partner rather than answer book. And so what are we pulling from this, and then how does it connect with the other parts of the story that we know and where we're going? So, again, no one really wants to talk about this question, but it might be something that you want to just kind of keep in mind and to think about, because then what are the sorts of ramifications? Well, just pulling in, finishing up here, just a couple other thoughts. There should just be a trigger warning on 2 Samuel 13, because what we do see is with Amnon and Tamar, a horrible story. It's an awful text. But we also understand in our own families or in family systems how one generation is shaped by, generations shape subsequent generations. And so in some ways we see the living out of what happened within David's family into the next generation and then beyond. And we're aware of how these sorts of things can happen. And then this gives us the backstory, because that's what's missing in the story, because we get just this little interstitial piece to get us to Absalom, David's son, who wants to follow as the king. But chapter 13 gives us the context and the explanation of how Absalom's story comes to be. So if you've got the gumption to read 2 Samuel 13, and then, read Luke 2, because, the nativity story, we all like that. But it's just make sure you're aware that it's a struggle. We got those Psalms 51 and 32. And then we're getting to the temple and the building of the temple. And I think it's worth just keeping in mind that God is, the way I read it at least, and this is probably a minority view, God is far more indifferent to the temple than we often think. Because David wants to build God a temple, because you've always taken care of us, but why do I get a nice place to live and you don't? And God's like, I'm going to build my dynasty through you. You don't need to build me a house. I'm going to build a house in you. God does that, and then, but then David's like, yeah, okay, but my kid's going to do it. And then I think the biblical writers writing back in were like, no, this is a good thing, because we love buildings. We love buildings. And there's always the temptation, though, to put something else in the place of God, even a good thing. So I'm not saying the temple's a bad thing. I'm just saying it's maybe not as unanimously great in God's opinion as we typically think it is. I think God is, a little more indifferent than we often think. So just something to keep in mind as we move forward because once we get to Solomon's building projects, it's Samuel turns out to be even more correct. So I'll stop there. You've got lots of stuff to talk about, lots of good insight, and then we'll see you next week to talk about getting into Solomon. Thanks, everyone.